Oh, hello Internet! And here we have another video on Hannah Arendt's anthology Between Past and Future. This is the 8th and final essay of the book, and just to address this, I started with the 5th essay on education, mostly out of interest because I am an educator. Moving directly on to the 6th essay was kind of a coincidence because I just remembered being confused by the essay when I first read it. I moved on to the 7th, and now I figure I may as well finish the latter half of the book first, which are the more practical and tangible subjects that Arendt considers, and then maybe I can move on to the abstract political substratum of the early essays. So, the conquest of space and the stature of man, eh? It's a lofty title, but right off the bat, let's start with some clarifications. First of all, man or mankind is precisely synonymous with human or humanity. It is absolutely gender neutral when read in the modern context, although we can be aware of possible biases, of course, and raise them whenever we consider they might be appropriate. I also want to draw attention at the outset to the distinction between the world and reality in this case. In some contexts, these two terms are used interchangeably. However, for Arendt, the world represents the human construction of everything that has raised us beyond simple hunter-gatherer subsistence living. This is as opposed to nature or the universe or reality or existence in the more abstract sense. Finally, the conquest of space is somewhat specific, and I imagine that Arendt chose the term because it is evocative to the layman, and for other reasons we might see in due course. But as we read the essay, we will see that the focus is rather on the general advancement of science into realms that extend beyond human understanding and human experience, except for our demonstrated ability to take these abstract concepts and turn them into effective power to control reality in various ways. The essay focuses on just one key question: has man's conquest of space increased or diminished his stature? In passing, I would note that although Arendt has phrased the question in the past tense, I would say that maybe the future tense would be more appropriate in this case. But then, we have 70 years on Arendt to see just how hollow the political commitment to the conquest of space turned out to be. Naturally, Arendt begins from Greece and Rome. The Romans, she says, considered man to be the highest being there was, and this is reflected in their sense of humanitas, which was, according to Arendt, the first instance of the idea of human dignity in history. The Greeks did have a similar idea of philanthropy, and I think some would disagree with Arendt in her characterization. But the idea that this gave humanity a certain stature is something that Arendt says we do take from the Roman tradition. This is one reason how the change from Greek to Roman culture in history represents a change in the nature of Western culture towards something which would eventually emerge into the monotheistic individualism that might characterize it today. To greatly simplify Arendt's thesis, as much as the conquest of space is a scientific endeavor, the scientists who pursue it are not necessarily the best to judge how it might affect the hypothetical stature of humanity, whatever that turns out to be. The stature of humanity is an inherently anthropocentric concept, and the project of science is specifically to get outside of all anthropocentric concerns. In fact, the very ideas of science may have passed beyond any possible measure of human comprehension, including that of the scientists themselves, who do remain irrevocably human. Arendt opens by saying the question propounded here is to the layman and must be answered in terms of common sense. As we've seen in previous essays, Arendt has a particular definition of common sense in mind, which is a little more nuanced than our everyday usage. It is the sense of the world that is common to all humans, our implicit ability to experience the world with others, and this of course is done through our senses, and therefore it creates a spread of things that humans generically agree on, but some of them are part of the universe more broadly, like objects or space itself, and some are limited to the Arendtian world and perhaps are less common as a result, like habits or moral norms. However, the reliance on sense perceptions of humans means that only things which are ultimately anthropocentric can ever be part of the common sense world, and common sense can clearly be culturally variable. Thus, the answer to the key question is not likely to convince the scientist because he has been forced under the compulsion of facts and experiments to renounce sense perception and hence common sense. For the scientist, man is no more than an observer of the universe. Despite the scientists' skepticism or even dismissal of the question, they have a growing problem within their own discipline. The data with which modern physical research is concerned turn up like mysterious messengers from the real world. They are not phenomena, neither in our everyday world or in the laboratory. We know of their presence only because they affect our measuring instruments in certain ways. It is crucial to reiterate, Arendt is not saying that the physical phenomena do not exist at all. She is simply saying that the data we collect are not the phenomena, and that humans have no sensory access to those phenomena. Strictly speaking then, these measured effects cannot be formally linked to what they actually are in reality. This, says Arendt, leads to scientists accepting the idea that physical data connect to a reality that is fundamentally more real than the sensory world we live in, and the high repeatability of their process does support this. The purpose of fundamental science, therefore, is no longer to categorize our correct perceptions of reality, but to penetrate those actually incorrect perceptions and find out the nature of the substratum of true reality beneath them. This will be relevant, but it does not seem to undermine the common sense question that we're actually asking. The question challenges the layman and the humanist to judge what the scientist is doing because it concerns all men. And this debate must, of course, be joined by the scientists themselves as they are fellow citizens. But all answers are non-scientific, although not anti-scientific. They can never be demonstrably true or false. Their truth resembles rather the validity of agreements than the compelling validity of scientific statements. Such truth can never command general agreement, but it frequently outlasts the compellingly and demonstrably true statements of the sciences which, especially in recent times, have the uncomfortable inclination never to stay put, although at any moment they are, and must be, valid for all. This relates back to our discussion of opinions in truth and politics. Those things which humans decide upon by consensus can sometimes become more durable than those things which are demonstrably true, especially in the short term, because not all people will take the time to confirm those demonstrable truths for themselves, especially if they are complex or counterintuitive. However, because of the fact that our common sense world is built on the discoveries made by the scientists, which is increasingly true in the modern world, means that the idea of science itself being valid must be one of those common sense factors that we depend upon, an article of faith, if you will. What makes this difficult in the modern world is the fact that science is changing extremely rapidly in many areas, and we are even discovering new ways to look at previously settled questions, and this is uncomfortable indeed. This problem relates to our key question because Arendt asks if science has in fact dismantled these traditionally settled questions, and if this actually affects the stature of humanity. Notions such as life, or man, or science, or knowledge are pre-scientific by definition, and the question is whether or not the actual development of science has changed these notions to such an extent that they no longer make sense. This sentence claims that choosing definitions for the important terms of science is actually a pre-scientific task, and that any significant change to these definitions is something that could herald a significant change in the stature of mankind. And I suppose this is as good a time as any to talk about exactly what is meant by this nebulous term, the stature of mankind, or at least what does Arendt mean by it. Later on in the essay, she will say that mankind seeks to have a larger territory, and that this is somehow integral in assessing the stature of man. In a way, this is obvious. Only an entity that has a larger stature is able to stand in command of a larger territory. This command of territory definition of the stature of man will become more nuanced, but it can be our first attempt. It can also be easily expanded to cover intellectual, economic, ideological, or even emotional territory, rather than just simple geographic territory. Taken to its extreme, which we shall see Arendt does not do, this definition could become rather materialistic, in that, via this idea of territory, the stature of man can be measured and compared in various empirical ways. This seems to give a significant advantage to the scientist. Indeed, Arendt suggests that the scientist might be able to exclude the layman and philosopher completely from any discussion of the stature of man. If it were true that we have come to live in a world that only the scientists understand, they would then be in the position of the few, whose superior knowledge entitles them to rule the many. But this division between the scientist and the layman, however, is very far from the truth. This regards what was said above. The scientist is still only human, and as humans they have absolutely no common sense understanding of the fundamental forces of physics and the quantum mechanics that determine them, nor of the great immensity of the cosmos and all of the various quantities contained therein. This led many of the illustrious scientists of the 20th century, Bohr, Planck, Einstein, Schrödinger, to claim that the modern scientist is actually again adrift in places that the human mind does not understand, and this time it seems as if we literally cannot understand them. The scientist has not only left behind the layman with his limited understanding, he has left behind a part of himself and his own power of understanding. In the words of Erwin Schrödinger, the new universe is not quite as meaningless as a triangular circle, but much more so than a winged lion. There are scientists who state that computers can do what a human brain cannot comprehend. If it should be true that we are surrounded by machines whose doings we cannot comprehend, although we have ourselves devised and constructed them, it would mean that the theoretical perplexities of the natural sciences on the highest level have invaded our everyday world. This robs the scientist of the high ground of their expertise, not in science of course, but in the wider human context that we are discussing when we talk about the key question. The scientist is not in any position to state that they have a fundamental grasp on the human world using the tools of their discipline. And yet, technology now means that our reliance on scientific principles has started to intrude upon the space in which the laity, including the scientists themselves, live the everyday existence of the human condition. It is also often overlooked that scientists are not, in fact, seeking to wield a tyranny of knowledge over the masses. They leave that to the politicians and the businessmen. And scientists are frequently the most cautious and humble in stating what their discoveries entail. In fact, nothing was more alien to the minds of these 20th century scientists than any will to power, nor were they prompted by an unseemly curiosity in the sense of a temptatio oculorum. In this last case, I suppose it depends on who defines unseemly, but Arendt's point is that it is not a lusting after experience that drove science. This does not rule out other forms of temptation. If this is not the goal of scientists, however, then it is fair to ask what is their goal, and Arendt does answer that. Scientists are inspired by an extraordinary love of harmony and lawfulness, which taught them that they would have to step outside any merely given, i.e. empirical, sequence or series of occurrences if they wanted to discover the overall beauty of the whole, that is, the universe. And maybe the devil is in the detail here, so to speak, because Arendt wonders further if this abstract love leads scientists to actually be less concerned with the empirical consequences of their work than with the theoretical upheavals in the scientific project. This will be important later, and it should be noted that there is a reason why scientists quite often fall in line with the politicians and the businessmen. We have now set up the field of the question regarding the stature of humanity. The stature of humanity could be thought of as an ability to command territory, whether that be physical, political, or spiritual. This command of territory imparts a certain agency, and science has the potential to affect that command and therefore that sense of agency. But how? What is our experience of this happening? This is the sub-question that we now turn our attention to. Science began with new thoughts, and while it remained in the purview of the educated layman, those thoughts alone were sufficient to change the world. A child can learn how the Copernican or Newtonian principles affect our experience, and with sufficient diligence they can prove it for themselves. However, as science has passed beyond the realm of intuitive thought, the compelling nature of its truths have diminished, and today it is entirely possible for people to coherently doubt things that have been demonstrated to be true to a high degree of accuracy. And the system of science itself can become inscrutable. For example, the standard of proof that scientists use to demonstrate this accuracy is called the 5 sigma standard, which simply means that something is 99.99999% likely to be true under the conditions of the test. 5 sigma is much easier to say, but it also sounds like an arcane ritual of some secret society. As we have come into the modern age then, the new thoughts, although more radical than ever, have ceased to be compelling to the layperson, even in principle. Now, the only thing that can make us perceive an increase in the stature of humanity is to see actual humans demonstrating the larger territory that we now command. An actual change in the human world is achieved only when manned space carriers are shot into the universe so that man himself can go, and crucially be seen to go, where up to now only human imagination and its power of abstraction, or human ingenuity and its power of fabrication, could reach. This unwieldy sentence nonetheless contains the nutshell of how and why a change in the stature of man is only possible when it is witnessed as part of the common sense world that we all share. Today, however, not only can many laymen doubt the counterintuitive truths of science, but scientists themselves cannot completely say where their certainties come from, only that they can be empirically shown. The Copernican and Newtonian revolutionaries dismantled the geocentric ideas, but Arendt recognizes that even they still required that the universe had a kind of center. This was expected to be seen, among other things, in the discovery of an ether wind, but then that hypothesis was overturned in due course. Where then is the new foundation, and how do we build from it? These are the kinds of questions that relate to the stature of humanity, but they are not even interesting to the scientist. They are not part of the scientific project. It is, in fact, quite obvious that the scientist's strongest intellectual motivation was Einstein's striving after generalization. Even today, the physicist is likely to look down on all these space scientists as mere plumbers. The sad truth of the matter is that the lost contact between the world of the senses and the physical world has been re-established not by the pure scientist, but by the plumber. And so it is that the stature of humanity comes to rest on the efforts of those engineers that permit actual humans to venture further than ever before, even though the scientists who enabled them may have, in the abstract sense, ventured further still. Again, we see that the stature of humanity is situated in the realm of common sense. It depends on what everyone can see, and only something that demonstrates our command of a wider territory to everyone can meaningfully affect what we agree to be true about ourselves as world builders. The scientist, however, will not raise their eyes to this. In fact, the scientist must pay no heed whatsoever to the stature of humanity, or they could not do their work effectively. Had the scientist raised questions such as what is the nature of man and what should be his stature, or what is the goal of science and why does man pursue knowledge, he would never have arrived at where modern science stands today. The answers to these questions would have acted as definitions and hence as limitations on his efforts. Despite this, Arendt is clear that the project of scientific advancement is a noble and necessary one, though it must maintain a link to what is human. The magnitude of the space enterprise seems to me beyond dispute, and all utilitarian objections sound to me slightly absurd. The very integrity of science demands that not only utilitarian considerations, but the reflection upon the stature of man as well, be left in abeyance. This continues on the idea that scientists were not actually motivated by earthly power. Of course, the politicians and the business people they work for are motivated by earthly power, and at the time Arendt wrote this essay, the stakes of this discovery process were extremely high, and almost any research path could have proved somehow decisive. Today, I think this situation largely persists. Who knows which technological breakthrough might lead to a sweeping advantage for someone? Additionally, Arendt wishes to point out that there is a danger to the scientists' often heedless pursuit of knowledge. The simple fact that physicists split the atom without any hesitation the very moment they knew how to do it demonstrates that the scientist qua scientist does not even care about the survival of the human race on Earth or even Earth itself. There is a drive in the scientist to discover the limits of what science is able to discover. Arendt seems to claim that this is almost something as fundamental as the reality that they are actually probing. It should be said that the scientists are not totally heedless. For example, before the first atomic bomb tests, the risk of igniting the atmosphere was treated seriously. But all of this leads us to Arendt's conclusion that it is futile to argue against the scientific project on the basis of utilitarian concerns. She says that valid and plausible arguments against the conquest of space could be raised only if they were to show that the whole enterprise itself might be self-defeating in its own terms, and there are a few indications that such might indeed be the case. So Arendt is saying that opposition to the conquest of space and other scientific advancements can be argued effectively only if the progress of science contradicts its own purpose. Otherwise, science gonna science, and the wider political context is probably going to support that. Arendt is not slavishly committed to science either though. In a way, she is deliberately ambivalent because it is actually not a black and white question and never can be. There is a tension between the scientist and the humanist, but this tension should never be allowed to boil over into battle, and neither one should be allowed to drive the other from the field of contention. There is a dynamic equilibrium to be struck. To show this, Arendt has, in the essay, articulated two apparently contradictory rhetorical questions on the stature of man. The first question is, how can anyone doubt that a science enabling man to conquer space and go to the moon has increased his stature? The second question is rather, has not each of the advances of science since the time of Copernicus almost automatically reduced the stature of mankind? These two questions indicate the emergent conflict, that one can claim, on the basis of science, two directly contradictory things. But Arendt does not claim this discovery, she credits it to Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle. The uncertainty principle states that certain quantities can be measured with greater precision only by reducing the precision of measuring some other quality. In other words, measuring certain things stops us from accurately measuring others. Heisenberg himself realized that this puts physics in the uncomfortable situation that the same events will be consistently described by different sets of physical laws, because within a system of physical laws which are based on certain fundamental ideas, only certain quite definite ways of asking questions make sense, and thus such a system is separated from others which allow other questions to be put. Heisenberg realized from this that no matter which system is applied, there will always be some subjectivity in the decisions that we make in appraising any subject, no matter how fundamental. The magnitude of this discovery brought the scientific endeavor back into the humanist realm. It is at this point, it seems to me, that the humanist concern with man and the stature of man has caught up with the scientist. It is as though the sciences had done what the humanities never could have achieved, namely to prove demonstrably the validity of this concern. The reason that the humanist question of the stature of man remains relevant is because the two questions above are being answered from independently consistent viewpoints. On the one hand, of course, any command of a greater territory leads to an increase in the stature of man. On the other hand, the more we learn about the universe, the smaller and less significant we realize we truly are. This dichotomy, says Arendt, oddly resembles an elaborate verification of a remark by Franz Kafka. Man, he said, found the Archimedean point, but he used it against himself. The Archimedean point here is in reference to Archimedes, who apocryphally said, "Give me a fulcrum and a lever long enough and I can move the world." This Archimedean point is that fulcrum, the substantial foundation required for any mechanical force to be applied. For the scientist, but not the humanist, the Archimedean point must be something outside of the human sphere, because in order to properly assess the causes and effects of the forces you wish to understand, you must be able to view the entire system. Science always, but modern science increasingly, needs to create this space for assessment out of the power of abstraction alone. And the conquest of space is only the most comprehensible aspect of science from the point of view of the layman. And yet, it is the layman and the philosopher who can judge with greater precision exactly what is the stature of man at any given time, their Archimedean point still relying on some sense of human dignity. Science cannot help but strain towards an external foundation, but if it is able and permitted to explain every facet and nuance of what humanity is, then, seen from a sufficient physical or intellectual distance, the cars in which we travel will look as though they were, as Heisenberg once put it, as inescapable a part of ourselves as the snail's shell is to its occupant. All our pride in what we do will disappear into some kind of mutation of the human race. The whole of technology no longer appears as the result of a conscious human effort to expand man's material powers, but rather as a large-scale biological process. The conquest of space and science that have made it possible have come perilously close to this point. If they should ever reach it in earnest, the stature of man would not simply have been lowered by all the standards we know of, but have been destroyed. Here, at the end of the essay then, we have a fairly good idea on Arendt's perspective of science and how it might relate to the stature of man. We even have a vague direction we might see the question leading, but we don't really have a clear answer to the binary question with which she started. And I think this is because Arendt has only obliquely answered what the stature of man consists in. The command of territory definition does beg the Euphythro-adjacent question: what is it that allowed the territory to fall under our command in the first place? I think that Arendt's goal, though, is just to identify the problem. She does not claim to have the solution. I will not claim to know her true feelings on the matter, but I have to conclude that her answer would tend towards decreased and ever diminishing. But this is because of the emphasis we have increasingly placed on scientific measurement, or data, in the modern world. This is another crisis of modernity. We have spent all of history trying to identify things and classify them, and thus control them to some extent. But there has always been opposition to accepting the changes to the human status quo that come from these new classifications, although there has always been a willingness to share in the benefits of these new classifications. But now the process of discovery has started to impose, or perhaps impose again, on some of the previous classifications that have been pivotal to something that we consider intrinsically important about the nature of our personal place in the human endeavour. In short, our stature. The stature of any object or creature is a form of comparison of itself to that which exists around it. Comparing things in any dimension needs a place from which to view them, an Archimedean point, so to speak. But Arendt's discussion makes it clear that the point from which the stature of the human race is judged is a different point from that from which we judge the truths of science as a practical project. Most scientists accept this. This contrast demonstrates another way of looking at the stature of mankind. It is the self-esteem of humanity, our measure of what we should even consider it valid for a member of our species to do, or try to do. And this is why it must remain something that all humans have access to. It does beg the question, however, of exactly what we are comparing ourselves to. Thus, science creating a series of Archimedean points that diverge from the common sense world has inevitably reduced the stature of man from the perspective of ultimately important in the universe. However, it has also increased the stature of man in the respect of able to wield energy, including command territory, within the universe, or at least within our own mortal estimations. Science has a paradoxical relationship with the stature of mankind, but if science continues down this path, and we have every reason to think that it will continue to be difficult for common sense to reconcile the diversion between these two interpretations of the stature of man. Arendt is perhaps slightly hyperbolic in saying that the stature of man will be destroyed, but at the same time, a radical shift in what the stature of man is, to the point where it may become unrecognizable, is that really any better?